Tonight on KQED Newsroom, President Trump under siege as his former lawyer calls him a liar and a racist. While in California, the state GOP undergoes major changes. We'll have a roundup of the week's top political news. Plus, President Trump and Kim Jong-un failed to reach a deal over North Korea's nuclear arsenal in their second summit. We'll take a look at the ramifications. And newly released documents show an alarming number of California police officers have committed crimes themselves, nearly 12,000 of them so far. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with a growing confrontation over the presidency. Michael Cohen, President Trump's former personal lawyer, delivered a scathing account Wednesday of what he says was a lying, cheating president who used his money and power to hide illegal behavior. Cohen told Congress Mr. Trump remained involved in paying hush money to a porn film actress even after arriving in the White House and directed him to lie about it. California played a prominent role in the House Oversight Committee hearing. The state has 6 members on the panel, and some of the most pointed questions came from Silicon Valley Congressman Ro Khanna and Southern California Representative Katie Hill. Meanwhile, California's Republican Party has picked a new leader, the first woman and first Latina to head the GOP. Joining me now to discuss all of this are Scott Schaefer, KQED Senior Editor of Politics and Government, Jason Clark, Bay Area Regional Vice Chair of the Californian Republican Party, and Tal Copen, Washington correspondent for the San Francisco Chronicle. She joins us via Skype from the nation's capital. Welcome to all of you. Tal, let's begin with you. What are the ripple effects in Washington following the Michael Cohen testimony? Will we be seeing additional investigations of people he implicated, including President Trump's son, Donald Jr., and his CFO, Alan Weisselberg?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, we're going to see more investigations. In some ways, Michael Cohen's testimony was sort of the kickoff of what's going to be probably several long months for the Trump administration. And, you know, he was actually up on Capitol Hill for 3 days this week testifying. Only one day was public. That was the one before the Oversight Committee. And that committee has already said they want to bring before them everyone he mentioned by name in his testimony. And what they're really going to have jurisdiction over is looking at some of these ethical issues and financial issues, really diving into the Trump Organization, and the Trump Foundation was mentioned in his testimony. Those types of things are really the domain of the Oversight Committee. And then we already have the Intelligence Committee, where Michael Cohen also appeared in a classified setting that's investigating a lot of the Russia issues. And then the Judiciary Committee is also interested in most of this and has sort of pieces of both where it falls in sort of the criminal legal sphere. So you're going to see all those committees begin to sort of start diving in and untangling what they see as a web relating to President Trump.
And what we saw on TV this week, Scott, was quite extraordinary and dramatic. And going back to the House Oversight Committee, the public hearing, there are 6 Californians who are members of that committee. What stood out for you in their line of questioning? We heard from Jackie Speer, we heard from Ro Khanna, we heard from Katie Hill from Southern California.
Yeah, Harley Ruda as well from Orange
Ruda.
County. You know, I think in some ways the most extraordinary thing, Thuy, is that this hearing happened at all. You know, for the first 2 years of the Trump administration, Democrats didn't really have any power in the House or the Senate. Now they do, and they're going to have, as you just heard, hearing after hearing after hearing. I think that in some ways, you know, this was a huge stage for 2 freshmen in particular. But I think, you know, Jackie Speer is an attorney, Ro Khanna is an attorney, and I think in some ways they really got to the heart of some things. But the one exchange that I think has really gone viral is when Jackie Speer asked Cohen, how many times has Mr. Trump asked you to threaten a person or an institution? 50 times more, 100 times more. And that has now become a meme that's all over the internet. And I think in some ways it's more funny than anything, although it does indicate just what kind of an operation Michael Cohen was part of.
And Jason, you're watching this, and what's going through your mind? What are the key takeaways from Cohen's testimony for you as a member of the Republican Party?
Well, I think it's a big charade. The Democrats do not like this president, and they are trying as much as possible to just take him out. The Mueller investigation hasn't given them really anything credible to directly tie him to any wrongdoing. So they've reduced themselves to dragging a disbarred lawyer who has been known to lie to come and tell a big story to the committee. And it makes for great television. It makes for a big distraction on the North Korea summit that was happening at the same time. But as we've seen, Already, Mr. Cohen is being referred to the Justice Department for perjury based on his testimony to Congress.
Doesn't it strike you, though, that none of the Republicans really came to President Trump's defense, that they were all there to impugn Michael Cohen? I mean, why didn't they stand up and defend the president?
Well, I think it's a complete charade. You have somebody who is known to be a liar and who is just making things up as he goes.
But he lied on behalf of the president. The president directed him to lie.
He's the president's attorney, and as an attorney myself, I find it very discouraging and disturbing that when the president relied on him for legal advice, he did illegal things. When the president hires a lawyer, when anyone hires a lawyer, they want the lawyer to follow the law to keep them out of legal trouble, and it's clear here that Michael Cohen did not do that.
Let's let Tal get a word in here. Tal?
Oh, I was just going to say, it sort of speaks to, you know, the sort of complicated way that these hearings play out. So, you know, some of the members sort of treat it as if it's a trial, except there's no jury or judge. You're sort of appealing to the American people at home, and that sort of seemed to be what Republican strategy writ large was geared around, was this notion of let's just sort of impugn the character of Michael Cohen as a way of signaling to the American public that they shouldn't, you know, believe what he said. But you also saw members sort of look at this as an opportunity to begin to establish a record. This was sort of the approach of, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ro Khanna, to an extent, was sort of establish things based on the Michael Cohen testimony that the committee can then turn around and subpoena, looking like they were more sort of preparing sort of footnotes for an eventual report that the committee might put out. So that's sort of why it feels so disjointed sometimes, is they're all trying to accomplish different things.
And moving beyond the hearing itself, in terms of what happens next, what are some of the challenges now for Democrats, for example? Because you have liberal lawmakers on the one hand saying, hey, let's, you know, find a way to start the impeachment process, and then others in the Democratic Party who are saying, whoa, 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 not quite yet.
Yeah, I think that's the tension, absolutely. And I think Pelosi knows that impeachment is an inherently political thing, and if you do it in a partisan way, it's going to come back and bite you, just as it did the Republicans when they impeached Bill Clinton. I think in some ways, you know, it isn't just the Mueller investigation that's happening. You've got the Southern District of New York, the U.S. attorney there, who Michael Cohen said he's in constant contact with. If I were Donald Trump and the Republicans, you know, I would be a little concerned about where that's going, quite apart from the Mueller investigation.
And what about the Republicans, Jason, who keep on standing by the president through all this? What are the risks they face?
Well, I think there's a risk, actually, that if we break party unity, then a lot of the things, the agenda items that Donald Trump wants to get done, such as immigration reform and like that, won't actually get done because we'll be too busy infighting.
All right, I want to also talk about Gavin Newsom, because the governor was in Washington this week. He was attending a conference of governors, and he also attended a White House dinner hosted by President Trump. Tal, I know you covered that visit. What is his biggest challenge now as he's trying to build relationships in Washington, D.C., relationships with the Trump administration at a time when California has filed at least 45 lawsuits against White House policies?
Yeah, it was sort of funny. I was standing outside the U.S. Senate chamber, and off the elevator walks Gavin Newsom, who was coming around with Senator Dianne Feinstein. So I actually spoke with him for about 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes, that duality was on full display. On the one hand, I spoke with him. He said he has had many conversations with President Trump, both in person and over the phone, and he's really making a concerted effort to build an open line of communication and a non-political relationship so that when a disaster happens, like the wildfires last year, that he knows he can have a relationship with Trump and make sure that the state gets the relief it deserves. At the same time, in that same conversation, he sort of, you know, dropped into conversation that his state was leading the lawsuit challenging the national emergency declaration to move funds to build the southern border wall. So he's really sort of straddling the line. What it seems to me is that he's trying to, you know, in direct conversation with Donald Trump, kind of keep the temperature down, and then let them both go back to their corners and sort of offer the mouthpiece roles that each of them has to play.
And I want to focus also on state politics, because we had the state Republican Party convention recently, and there's a whole new roster of people in office, including you in your new position. And it made some incredible news because the new chair is Jessica Patterson, first Latina to hold the position, first woman to hold the position. Jason, what issues can we expect to see at the top of her agenda as she takes over?
Well, I know one of the many things at the top of her agenda is outreach to communities that that sometimes Republicans have traditionally ignored. Latinos, young Asian Americans. The older generations traditionally voted Republican, and the younger generations are not. So I know that she's going to make a real effort to target them for outreach and for voter registration. You know,
I would say Jim Brulte, who has been the chair for 6 years, that was very much at the top of his agenda as well. And he was very effective, I think, in a lot of ways. The problem is they have a mountain worth of problems that they have to climb, and not the least of which is having Donald Trump in the White House. I mean, Catherine Baker, a moderate Republican in the Bay Area, lost her reelection to the Assembly. She said having an R next to her name was toxic for voters. People liked her, but they didn't like the party. And, you know, it's been 12 years now since the Republicans have won a statewide office. Schwarzenegger was the last one, along with Steve Poizner. And so they have some real work to do. It's going to take a lot more than just outreach. They have to, I think, change their image and have to come up with some candidates that are appealing not just to Republicans, but to independent voters as well.
Do you think the fact that Patterson is Latino, will that help her with Latino candidates in California, especially when many of them have been feeling not very fond of the Republican Party because of its stand on illegal immigration?
Yeah, I think that's really different. It's helpful always to have a fresh face and someone who's a woman and someone who's Latina. It's a great talking point. But as I said, the party is so out of step with where California is on immigration, climate change, and gun control and other issues. It's a really tough for her. It's like a little bit like rearranging the chairs on the deck chairs on the Titanic.
All right,
we did see in 2018 that some, Latino Republican candidates nationally still lost their seats, under the weight of some of the party's moves on immigration. You look at Carlos Curbelo in Florida, for example. He ran an incredibly moderate campaign. Jeff Denham as well. They were on the forefront of trying to get, very moderate immigration reform passed in Congress, and it was not enough to save their seats back in the district. To a certain extent, sometimes the winds are just blowing so hard nationally, it can be very difficult back home.
Okay, we will have to leave it there. Tal Cohen with the Chronicle in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us via Skype. And also thanks to Scott Schaefer and also Jason Clark for being here. Nice to have you all.
Thank you.
Now to an international development that's being closely watched in the Bay Area. President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un abruptly ended their summit in Vietnam this week after they failed to reach a deal to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. President Trump said North Korea wanted the lifting of all international sanctions in exchange for closing only one nuclear site. But North Korea's foreign minister disagreed, contending North Korea only wanted partial sanctions relief to end its enrichment of nuclear material. No announcement has been made on future talks. Still, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and President Trump stressed that progress had been made since the first meeting between the two leaders last year in Singapore. Joining us now is Yong Lee, Deputy Director of the Korea Program at Stanford University. Nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Tui.
So you wrote an article as recently as this week for the news site The Diplomat, talking about what you call the intimate bond between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Then one day after your article, the summit abruptly ends. How would you characterize their relationship now?
Well, I think it did abruptly end, but the relationship seems to be still not in bad in terms, for sure. It seems like when Trump walked away, he did mention that they're still willing to negotiate. One thing that was noticeable is that when North Korea presented this result in their own domestic newses, they never mentioned that Trump walked away, that they're still working towards making progress. So I think both of them are trying to maintain the close ties and trying to be hopeful of what might come up next.
But this was their second summit in 8 months. They had much more time this time around than they did during the talks in Singapore to prepare, to kind of think ahead about what the deal might be. So why wasn't more progress made?
Yes, it is somewhat unexpected. Even the North Korean and the U.S. diplomatic teams met together earlier or last week to actually work out the details before going into the summit. But this just happened. So there seems to have been an unexpected factor that came up during their talks.
What do you think that factor was?
And I think the North Koreans wanted something bigger than that was initially discussed upon. And rightfully so, I think President Trump backed out of that deal.
How much of a role do you think the politics in this country had in what happened? during those talks in Vietnam, because he was overseas, but I'm sure that the North Koreans, especially Kim Jong-un, could not miss the drama that was unfolding here with the Michael Cohen testimony. Did that affect President Trump's standing and leverage in the negotiations?
I think that is a very correct observation. The North Koreans observe U.S. politics very closely. And they know that there is an election cycle here, and I think they followed the recent turn of events with the Cohen testimony yesterday, a few days ago. And maybe I think that factored into their decision of, okay, maybe Trump is willing to strike a bigger deal to divert attention to this, and maybe they put on a bigger package than they had initially agreed upon, and maybe hopefully assuming that Trump would actually bite it.
What kinds of sanctions are they most focused on? What do they want lifted?
So one thing we learned out of this is that sanctions really do matter for them, right? It was the sanctions that they were really keen on, trying to relax some of these sanctions. And so I've actually done some research on sanctions myself.
You're an economist by training.
Yes, I am an economist. So my research into North Korea initially was looking into how sanctions affect the North Korean economy. And one thing I found was that, especially up until 2013 or so, the elites tried to shield the negative impact of sanctions at the cost of the marginal hinterlands. Mm-hmm. But the recent round of sanctions, the so-called maximum pressure sanctions that were levied since 2016, target exports of coal, iron ore, or minerals, which are the major source of revenue for that country, and ban imports of oil or luxury goods. And what that does is it targets the elites of Pyongyang. And they're the one who are feeling the grunt of the pain now as well. And the elites matter to Kim Jong-un. I mean, yeah.
Well, so if the elites are starting to hurt, mm-hmm. then you would think that the pressure on Kim Jong-un will be building, right? To get these sanctions lifted. So what do you think he will do next? Is there a risk here that he will escalate nuclear fuel production to put pressure on President Trump to lift those sanctions?
Well, I think that would be a risky move. And first of all, yesterday, the North Koreans actually gave press release where their foreign minister said that they would not continue testing. I think that's the right direction, because once they start testing, we're basically back to ground zero. Mm. So I think that's not the way they would want to pursue this, but I think maintaining channels of negotiation and conversation will be the critical point forward for them to try to relax some sanctions and develop the economy.
And so what do you think will need to happen now to bring them back to the negotiation table?
It is a difficult situation, but I think they'll try to maintain some sort of way to communicate with the U.S. Obviously, the leagues in office didn't materialize, but if they currently, the past couple of months, I believe the North Koreans and the U.S. diplomatic teams have been in good relations. So if they continue this path, there might be some hope for that, a better outcome.
And just real quickly, just 15 seconds left, but you know, President Trump also said that he and Kim Jong-un discussed the case of Otto Warmbier, the American college student who died last year after being imprisoned in North Korea, and said he takes Kim Jong-un at his word that he didn't know about Warmbier's medical condition. Is that possible that he wouldn't know?
That I am also a bit skeptical about, that he wouldn't know about this. Given how important and grave the situation was, I would imagine he would have known.
All right. Yong Lee, Deputy Director of Stanford's Korea Program, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We turn our attention now to police misconduct. A joint investigation by several news organizations, including KQED, has brought to light a lengthy, previously secret list of police officers accused of crimes. A new California law allows the media and the public to request certain police records that were previously inaccessible. The newly released records reveal a disturbing reality. In the last 10 years, nearly 12,000 police officers have committed crimes ranging from shoplifting to embezzlement to child pornography. Attorney General Javier Becerra is responding forcefully, threatening legal action against the reporters who obtained the documents. Here now is one of those reporters, Robert Lewis of the UC Berkeley Investigative Reporting Program, as well as Thomas Peel, an investigative reporter who covers government accountability and public records for the East Bay Times. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Robert, the records you obtained cover law enforcement officers who have committed crimes over the past decade, nearly 12,000 in all, officers and people who were applying to be police officers. What were some of the most egregious crimes that you uncovered?
It's everything you can imagine. As you indicated in the intro, it's everything from shoplifting, petty theft, to stealing money from the department, to domestic violence, to murder.
Somebody even robbed a bank wearing a beard.
Wearing a fake beard. There was a former officer. That was covered some in the local media. But yes, it's a pretty broad range.
And how many of these officers are still on the job?
We don't know that. So the agency that gave it to us, as well as the Attorney General's office, refuses to say who on this list is actually a current or former officer, as opposed to, say, an applicant. We're trying to analyze it. It's one of the things we're doing now. But we know there are officers who have committed crimes, who have been convicted of crimes, who are currently working in the state of California as peace officers. We just don't know how many.
And these records were provided by the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training in response to routine public records requests. And Thomas, this takes place amid a larger battle over California's new police transparency law, which took effect January 1st. It's known as Senate Bill 1421. Explain to us what that law does.
SB 1421 opens certain police disciplinary records. Officers who were found to have committed sexual assault, which is defined broadly in the law, and also dishonesty-related offenses, lied in a report, planted evidence on someone. Those records become public. They also release records of serious use of force incidents, including officer-involved shootings, regardless of what the disciplinary outcome of the investigation of that incident was.
And then how are law enforcement groups responding to this new law?
There are numerous police unions around the state that have gone to court seeking temporary restraining orders, trying to block release of the records, claiming that the law is not retroactive. 5 judges have ruled so far on the temporary restraining orders. 4 judges have ruled in favor of disclosure.
And these records have stayed secret for so long. The public has never had a chance to look at them. And on a separate issue, the records that you got fell under a different law, right? But State Attorney General Javier Becerra, Robert, is threatening legal action against you as well and other reporters who obtained details about the roughly 12,000 officers who have been convicted of crimes. He says he has privacy concerns.
To give you a little bit of background, so there is within the state of California and within the Attorney General's office a database of convictions for everybody, not just peace officers, current and former. And there was a technical change in the law that allowed this accrediting body called POST to more easily label people within their database as being disqualified from being peace officers. And so to comply with that law, basically what POST did is they went to the DOJ, state DOJ, and said, hey, give us a list of everyone in our database who has been convicted of a crime. And that's what the AG's office prepared and gave to this POST commission. And my understanding is what they were going to do is go through it and figure out who in their database they should flag as being disqualified from serving in law enforcement.
Thomas, police unions say this whole situation is unfair, making all these documents public because they say there's no mandated broad public disclosure of crimes by other professionals like doctors and teachers. Are they being singled out?
Well, if anyone should be singled out, it should be government employees who have the most power against any individual Californian. They have the right to take your liberty away and have certain circumstances where they can take your life away. These are the employees that we should know the most about, not the least. For 40 years in California, we've known the least about the conduct of police officers and what they get disciplined for within their ranks. We also know that an incredibly high percentage of police officers are honorable public servants who risk their lives every day to save people, to help Californians. It's kind of mind-boggling to think that those who carry themselves at the highest ethical standards wouldn't want the disclosure about those who don't.
And as we mentioned, you're both part of a broad reporting project that includes KQED, looking at police misconduct. In the end, what is the bigger picture, Robert, that you're hoping to give the public by gaining access to all these police misconduct records?
Well, I think Tom sort of alluded to it. It's building trust in the system. I mean, I think the public has an oversight role. You know, we, the public, empower law enforcement and law enforcement officers to have these capabilities of taking liberty, taking life, to protect us. But we then have a right and conceivably a responsibility to provide some measure of oversight. And without the information, we can't serve that function. And I'd give you just one tiny example that's a local example. One of the officers I mentioned in the story was a San Francisco cop who was pleaded guilty to accessing confidential information inappropriately. Around the same time, there was another officer also within the San Francisco Police Department convicted of basically the same crime. Now, both of those were handled by Internal Affairs within the SFPD, so it seems like they took it seriously. But because neither of those cases were reported publicly, there was no public discussion over the controls of confidential information. We, the public lost out on the ability to provide that oversight role.
I know there's certainly more to come because you're both still continuing to investigate this. Robert Lewis with the UC Berkeley Investigative Reporting Program and Thomas Peel with the Bay Area News Group. Thank you both.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Before we go, we'd like to mark the passing of San Francisco public defender Jeff Adachi. He died last Friday at the age of 59. Adachi was the state's only elected public defender. He was a tireless advocate for criminal justice reform, including ending cash bail for criminal defendants and defending immigrants facing deportation. Adachi appeared on our program a year ago to talk about a bill later passed in San Francisco to eliminate the hefty fees and fines criminal defendants have to repay when they're released from jail.
We want to encourage people to live productive lives, crime-free lives, not feel like they have to break the law in order to support their families. And a lot of people in San Francisco are in this situation. And so if you're going to burden them with fines and fees, it's kind of like a payday loan in a sense, right? Because you plead guilty, and a lot of people plead guilty just to get out of jail because they can't afford bail. And then when they get out of jail, they have this huge debt on their back. And what's going to happen? They're going to feel more pressure to do something desperate in order to pay these fines and fees.
And there will be a public memorial service for Jeff Adachi on Monday at 11 a.m. at San Francisco City Hall. That will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.